The air around the abandoned Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital was heavy with an unsettling stillness, as though the very ground itself held its breath. The building loomed like a specter, its crumbling walls standing as a grim testament to the unspeakable horrors that had once unfolded within. Overgrown vines snaked up the facade, and the windows, long shattered, stared like hollow, soulless eyes. The night had fallen thick and oppressive, the moon barely peeking through the clouds, casting fleeting glimmers of light across the hospital grounds. Inside a rented van, 4 figures sat in tense silence. They were amateur ghost hunters, eager to document their experience inside one of the most infamous haunted places in South Korea. Leading the group was Daniel, a man in his mid-30s, whose fascination with the paranormal had turned into an obsession. He had spent weeks researching Gonjiam, convinced that this night would make their documentary project legendary. Alongside him were his girlfriend, Hannah, and their friends, Jisoo and Hyun, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany them. As the van came to a stop near the rusted front gate, Daniel could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on his chest. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Yet, as he looked out at the decaying structure, a chill ran down his spine. The hospital seemed to exude a palpable malevolence, as though it was waiting for them to cross the threshold. "You sure about this, Dan?" Jisoo's voice wavered as he spoke, his eyes flicking nervously toward the building. "I mean, people say they see things here, feel things." Daniel chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To catch something on camera that no one's ever captured before." He lifted the video camera from his lap, its blinking red light the only thing cutting through the darkness. "This place is legendary for a reason." Hannah, sitting beside him, squeezed his arm reassuringly, though her own face betrayed unease. She had supported Daniel's passion for years, but something about this place felt different, darker. As they stepped out of the van, the night seemed to close in around them. The wind howled faintly through the surrounding trees, but otherwise, everything was unnervingly quiet. Daniel approached the gate first, pushing it open with a loud, rusty groan. Beyond it lay the hospital courtyard, strewn with debris and fragments of forgotten lives. They crossed the yard, their flashlights sweeping across the skeletal remains of the once bustling institution. The front doors of Gonjiam hung ajar, as though inviting them in. Daniel hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, followed closely by the others. The air within the hospital was frigid, far colder than the night outside, and it carried the unmistakable stench of decay. Dust motes floated in the beams of their flashlights, swirling in the dead air. "Jesus, it smells awful in here," Hyun muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "Let's get this done," Daniel replied, trying to mask the growing knot of dread in his stomach. He raised the camera and began filming, the lens capturing the peeling wallpaper and collapsed ceiling tiles that lined the entrance hall. They moved deeper into the hospital, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Each creak and groan of the old building set their nerves on edge, but Daniel pressed on, determined to find evidence of the supernatural. After an hour of wandering through the decayed hallways, they reached the heart of the hospital, the treatment ward. This was where, according to legend, the patients had begun to die under mysterious circumstances. Some said the head doctor had gone mad, performing twisted experiments on the mentally ill. Others whispered that the hospital had become cursed, haunted by the souls of those who had suffered there. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights simultaneously. Panic erupted within the group. "What the hell?" Hannah's voice quivered as she fumbled to turn her light back on. "Everyone stay calm," Daniel said, though his heart raced. He clicked his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't just the wind. From the far end of the corridor, a low, almost imperceptible whisper reached their ears. At first, it was too faint to make out the words, but it grew louder, closer. The voice was speaking in Korean, though none of them could understand the exact meaning. It was clear that it was filled with malice. Jisoo, the only native Korean speaker, turned pale. It's saying we need to leave." "Perfect," Daniel said, raising the camera again, though his hands were trembling. "This is exactly what we came for." But as they stood frozen in the corridor, the whispering grew into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and blending together into a terrifying chorus. Shadows moved along the walls, twisting and writhing as though alive. And then, without warning, the temperature plummeted, and the screams began, faint at first, but growing louder and more agonizing with each passing second. It was the sound of pure terror, of souls trapped in eternal torment. And as the screams filled the air, Daniel realized with a sickening certainty that they had awakened something in Gonjiam, something that had been lying dormant, waiting for fresh souls to torment. "Run," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the din. "We need to get out of here now." But it was already too late. The hospital seemed to pulse with an unnatural life as they scrambled down the hallway, the cacophony of whispers and screams echoing off the dilapidated walls. Daniel's camera swung wildly in his hands as he ran, its red light flickering on and off, capturing only glimpses of the chaos around them. The temperature had dropped sharply, and with every breath, their exhalations turned to thick clouds of fog in the air. Hannah was ahead, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hand as she looked back at Daniel with wide, terrified eyes. "Daniel! We need to leave, now!" Behind them, the shadowy figures they had glimpsed earlier began to take form, vague human shapes, twisted and distorted. Their eyes, if they had any, were black holes, voids that seemed to suck in the light. Their mouths gaped open, yet the screams seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jisoo stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him as though the very floor had turned to quicksand. Hyun grabbed him by the arm, yanking him upright as the sound of footsteps, rapid, erratic, rushed toward them from behind. "They're getting closer!" Hyun shouted, the panic evident in his voice. "What the hell are those things?" "I don't know!" Daniel yelled back, his throat tight with fear. "Just keep moving." The group careened through the narrow, decaying halls, trying to navigate the maze of the old hospital. Every corner they turned led them deeper into the building's labyrinthine corridors, the screams growing louder, the air colder with every step. The hospital seemed to stretch and bend, like it was warping time and space itself to keep them trapped inside. The further they ran, the more lost they became. "Daniel, the exit!" Hannah screamed, pointing to the end of a long hallway. The front doors, though far, were visible once again, standing open as they had when they'd first entered. "We're almost there," Daniel urged, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the presence behind them, those shadowy figures, gaining on them. He didn't dare look back. But as they neared the exit, the hospital's oppressive grip tightened. The floorboards creaked ominously, then buckled beneath Jisoo's feet. He let out a cry as he plummeted into the darkness below, disappearing in an instant. "Jisoo!" Hyun screamed, dropping to his knees at the edge of the pit that had suddenly opened up in the floor. He shone his flashlight into the abyss, but it illuminated nothing, only an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light whole. Daniel skidded to a stop, his chest heaving as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. "What the hell is this place?" His voice was thick with horror, the realization dawning that Gonjiam was not just haunted, it was alive, feeding on their fear. "We can't go back for him," Hannah cried, grabbing Daniel's arm. "If we stay, we're all going to die." Hyun stood frozen at the edge of the hole, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't just leave him." But before Daniel could respond, the hallway began to shift again. The walls groaned as though under immense pressure, and the distant wails of the tormented souls became ear-splitting. The shadowy figures surged forward, their movements now frantic and jerky, their distorted faces barely visible through the dim light. "They're coming!" Hannah shouted, pulling at Daniel with all her strength. "We have to go now." With one last, pained look at the spot where Jisoo had fallen, Daniel turned and ran. Hyun hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, his face twisted with guilt and fear, before he too bolted after them. The three of them sprinted down the remaining length of the hallway, the sound of their pounding footsteps mingling with the shrieks and howls that echoed all around them. Just as they reached the open doors, a loud slam reverberated through the air, and the massive wooden entrance swung shut with a thunderous crash, sealing them inside. "No! No, no, no!" Hannah shrieked, throwing herself at the doors, pounding on them with both fists. But they didn't budge. They were trapped. Daniel staggered backward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He felt like the walls were closing in, the darkness pressing down on them from all sides. He had thought this would be their grand adventure, the one story that would put them on the map. Now, it was becoming their grave. Hyun panted beside him, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "There has to be another way out. We can't stay here, those things will kill us." Daniel's mind raced, his thoughts muddled by the overwhelming fear. They were still near the entrance, there had to be another exit somewhere close. He glanced down one of the side hallways, and something caught his eye. It was faint, but at the far end of the corridor, there was a small flicker of light, like a distant glow. "I see something." Daniel pointed down the hallway. "There's a light. Maybe it leads to a way out." Without waiting for a response, he started running, Hannah and Hyun following close behind. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly as they moved toward the flickering glow, though the haunting whispers never ceased. The cold air clung to their skin, the sensation of being watched ever present. As they neared the source of the light, they found themselves at the entrance of an old elevator shaft. The metal doors were partially open, the flickering light coming from somewhere deep within the shaft itself. It wasn't an exit, but it was something, anything to get them away from the horrors that lurked in the hospital's main hallways. "Are we really doing this?" Hyun asked, his voice shaking. "We don't know where it goes." Daniel stepped toward the shaft, his flashlight aimed downward. "It doesn't matter. Whatever's down there is better than what's coming for us up here." Before anyone could protest, a loud, otherworldly roar echoed from behind them, closer than before. The shadows were moving again, converging on their location with terrifying speed. "We don't have a choice," Daniel said. "We have to go. Now." Without another word, he pulled open the elevator doors wider and climbed into the shaft, carefully lowering himself down the rickety metal ladder that lined the wall. Hannah followed next, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she descended. Hyun hesitated, his heart racing as the shadowy figures approached, but the choice was clear. He took a deep breath and followed them down into the abyss, praying that whatever waited below was kinder than the horrors that stalked them above. But deep down, they all knew there was no escaping Gonjiam. The air inside the elevator shaft was stale, thick with the smell of rust and mold. Every inch of the metal ladder groaned under their weight as Daniel, Hannah, and Hyun descended into the darkness. The flickering light from above vanished as soon as they moved deeper, swallowed by the black void that stretched endlessly below. Each breath echoed unnervingly in the confined space, and the only sound was the metallic clinking of their feet on the rungs. "How far down does this go?" Hyun whispered, his voice tight with fear. Daniel didn't respond. His heart was pounding too loudly in his ears for him to focus on anything else. Every rung he grasped felt colder than the last, as if the deeper they went, the more the hospital itself was pulling them into its suffocating grip. It felt like they were descending not just into the bowels of the building, but into some kind of underworld, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Suddenly, a sharp clang echoed from above. Something had hit the metal of the elevator shaft. Hard. What was that? Hannah's voice trembled, her flashlight shaking as she instinctively aimed it upward. Daniel froze, holding his breath, eyes locked on the dark above them. There, at the top of the shaft, something moved, something large, its presence just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. It shifted, scraping against the metal. Then, slowly, the figure leaned into the light. It was one of the shadowy entities, but now it had form. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were deep, empty voids. Its mouth was a gaping black hole, stretching far beyond what should have been humanly possible. And then it grinned, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Daniel's heart seized in his chest. "Move! Now!" he shouted, urging them downward. His voice cracked with terror. The creature released a bone-chilling screech and began its descent, moving with unnatural speed, slithering down the walls of the shaft like a monstrous spider. It scraped the walls as it descended, leaving deep gouges in the metal. "Go, go, go!" Hyun screamed, his legs shaking as he tried to quicken his pace. But it was too late. The creature was faster. They hadn't made it halfway down before the entity was upon them. Its icy fingers wrapped around Hyun's ankle, pulling him with a strength that nearly yanked him off the ladder. "Hyun!" Hannah screamed. Hyun let out a terrified cry, kicking wildly. "Get it off me! Get it off!" Daniel's mind raced. He reached into his backpack, fumbling for something, anything, that could save them. His hand closed around a flare gun, something they'd brought along as a last resort precaution. Without thinking, he yanked it out, aimed it at the creature's face, and fired. The flare shot out in a burst of blinding red light, hitting the entity square in its gaping mouth. It let out an ear-piercing shriek as the fire consumed it, its body writhing and flailing. The heat from the flare was intense, filling the confined space of the shaft with a burning light that illuminated everything for just a moment. Daniel, Hannah, and Hyun shielded their eyes from the blaze as the creature shrieked and fell backward, disappearing into the darkness below. For a moment, there was silence. Nothing but the sound of their heavy breathing filled the air. But then, from far below, came a new sound. A low, deep rumble, as though the hospital itself was waking up. The walls of the shaft began to vibrate, and the entire structure seemed to groan in protest. "We have to move," Daniel shouted, his voice ragged. "Now!" They descended faster, sliding down the rungs as fast as they dared, their hands burning against the cold metal. But as they reached the bottom of the shaft, the elevator doors opened on their own with a slow, eerie creak, revealing a long, dark hallway beyond. Hannah stepped out first, her flashlight sweeping across the floor. "Where are we?" Daniel looked around. The corridor was unlike any part of the hospital they'd seen before. The walls were smooth, sterile, and the air felt colder, thicker, as if it were pressing down on them. Hyun shivered, rubbing his arms. "This doesn't feel right. We're deeper than we should be. We should have hit the basement." "I don't think this is the basement," Daniel said, his voice low. "I think we've gone somewhere else." As they moved forward, the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every step they took echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made it seem like they were being followed. The oppressive silence gnawed at them, broken only by the occasional distant scream that seemed to come from the very bones of the hospital. Then, without warning, the hallway shifted. The walls flickered like a broken TV screen, rippling and warping. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay, and the floor beneath their feet turned to something soft, almost squishy. Daniel looked down, his stomach twisting in horror. The floor had transformed into a carpet of flesh, pulsing, writhing, as though the hospital itself had become a living entity. "Oh my God," Hannah whispered, her face pale. "What the hell is happening?" He unstepped back, his foot sinking slightly into the fleshy ground. "We need to get out of here. This isn't real. It can't be real." But before they could retreat, the walls began to close in, slowly at first, then faster, as if the hospital was trying to crush them. The distant screams grew louder, more frantic, and the sound of something massive, something alive, slithered through the walls. Daniel's mind raced. There had to be a way out, but every direction they turned seemed to lead deeper into the nightmare. They were trapped, caught in the very heart of Gonjiam's madness. Suddenly, ahead of them, a door appeared, a single, rusted door at the end of the hallway. It was old and decrepit, barely hanging on its hinges, but it was their only hope. "That's our way out," Daniel yelled, pointing toward it. Without hesitation, they ran, their feet squelching against the grotesque floor. The walls continued to close in, and from behind them came the unmistakable sound of the shadowy creatures crawling toward them, their twisted forms just out of sight. Hannah reached the door first, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. It wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she cried, her voice desperate. Daniel pushed her aside, ramming his shoulder into the door with all his might. The wood groaned under the force, but it didn't break. Come on," he muttered, panic rising in his chest. The creatures were getting closer. He could feel their cold presence creeping up on them, hear the low, guttural growls just beyond the edge of the light. With one final push, the door burst open, and they tumbled through, slamming it shut behind them. They were safe for now. But as they looked around, they realized the nightmare wasn't over. They had emerged into a room, one that was far worse than anything they had seen before. The walls were lined with rusty hospital beds, each one occupied by a figure. Some were skeletal, others were bloated, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles. Their eyes were open, staring vacantly at the ceiling, but their mouths moved, whispering in a language none of them could understand. At the far end of the room stood a figure, dressed in a doctor's coat, its back turned to them. It stood perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for them all along. And then it turned. The figure in the doctor's coat stood at the far end of the room, its back unnaturally rigid. As it turned, the light caught its face, or what should have been a face. What stared back at Daniel, Hannah, and Hyun was a grotesque parody of human features, the skin pulled too tight across bone, and eyes sunken so deep they were little more than black voids. Its mouth was stitched closed with thick, rotting thread, though the skin around the stitches was torn, as if it had tried, violently, to scream. A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine, his breath catching in his throat. He instinctively took a step back, but his legs felt like they were moving through molasses, sluggish and weak. The doctor's head tilted slightly, studying them, as if deciding what to do with its new arrivals. Then, without warning, it moved. Its motion was quick, jerky, as though it wasn't walking but being dragged by some invisible force. Each step was accompanied by the sickening sound of bone grinding against bone, its limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Hannah grabbed Daniel's arm, her grip so tight it hurt. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel muttered, his eyes locked on the approaching figure. "But we need to move now." But the doctor was too fast. In the blink of an eye, it was upon them. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing Hyun by the throat with an inhuman strength, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. Hyun's eyes bulged in terror, his hands clawing at the doctor's arm, but it was useless. The doctor's grip tightened, and a low, guttural sound rumbled from its stitched mouth. "Let him go!" Daniel shouted, stepping forward and pulling the flare gun from his pack again. He had no idea if it would work a second time, but it was the only weapon they had. He aimed and fired, the flare shooting out in a blinding burst of red light. But this time, the doctor didn't scream or recoil. The flare hit its chest, sinking into the fabric of its coat, but it simply burned there, smoldering uselessly. The doctor's dark, empty eyes fixed on Daniel, and for a moment, he could feel its malevolent gaze boring into his soul, as if it was peeling back the layers of his mind, exposing every fear, every weakness. Hyun's screams grew weaker as the doctor tightened its grip. "Do something!" Hannah screamed, desperation in her voice. Daniel scanned the room, heart racing, looking for anything that could help. His eyes fell on a long, rusted pipe sticking out of one of the hospital beds. Without thinking, he lunged for it, yanking it free with a grunt. The metal was cold, heavy in his hands, but there was no time to hesitate. With all his strength, Daniel swung the pipe at the doctor's arm. It connected with a sickening crunch, the impact reverberating up his arms. The doctor let out a sound, a low, hollow moan, and for a brief moment, its grip on Hyun loosened. Hyun dropped to the ground, gasping for air, clutching his throat as he crawled backward, away from the creature. "Run!" Daniel shouted, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if the walls themselves were closing in, swallowing the sound. Hannah and Hyun scrambled toward the door, but Daniel's legs felt rooted to the spot. The doctor turned its attention to him now, its empty eyes narrowing, its stitched mouth twisting into something that resembled a grin. The air grew colder, and a wave of nausea washed over Daniel as he felt the room begin to shift, warping around them. The walls, once solid and sterile, began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. The hospital beds, with their grotesque occupants, seemed to melt into the floor, their bodies merging with the flesh-like ground. The air grew thick with the smell of rot, and the whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, filling Daniel's mind with incoherent gibberish. His head spun. He could feel himself slipping, his grip on reality loosening. The doctor was coming closer, its hands outstretched, fingers twitching as if eager to tear him apart. Then, a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. Hannah. She had doubled back, her face pale with fear but determined. In her hands was a small, handheld radio they'd brought along for communication. She smashed it into the doctor's head. The doctor staggered, its head snapping to the side with a sickening crack. It let out another low moan, but this time it was different, pain, confusion. It stumbled backward, its movements jerky and erratic, as if it had lost control of its body. "Come on!" Hannah grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We have to go." Together, they ran, leaving the writhing figure of the doctor behind. The room seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in, the floor rippling beneath their feet like a living, breathing organism. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. They burst through the door into the hallway, slamming it shut behind them. The moment the door closed, the sound stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Daniel leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, his heart racing. What the hell was that? Hannah shook her head, her face pale, her hands trembling. I don't know. But we can't stay here. We need to find a way out before it finds us again. Hyun, still gasping for breath, nodded weakly. This place, it's alive. It's trying to keep us here. Daniel glanced down the hallway, his eyes narrowing. There had to be a way out, somewhere. But every turn they'd taken had only led them deeper into the nightmare. The hospital wasn't just a building anymore. It was a living entity, twisting and warping around them, trapping them in its labyrinth of horrors. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Let's keep moving, Daniel said, his voice firm, though fear gnawed at the edges of his mind. We'll find a way out. We have to. With one final glance at the door behind them, the door that now seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, they turned and began to make their way down the hallway, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint, distant sound of something following them. Something that wasn't done with them yet. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, a dark tunnel of peeling walls and flickering lights. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the building was listening, waiting for its moment to strike again. Daniel, Hannah, and Hyun moved in silence, their eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, expecting the doctor, or something worse, to leap from the darkness. Keep moving, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the eyes of the hospital itself tracking their every move. Suddenly, the air shifted, growing colder, thicker, as if they had passed into another level of this nightmare. The smell of decay became overpowering, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the stench of something far older, more ancient than the hospital itself. Daniel's stomach twisted, and he fought the urge to vomit. Do you hear that? Hannah's voice was barely a whisper, her hand gripping Daniel's arm tightly. At first, he couldn't hear anything beyond his own breath and the faint hum of dying lights. But then, faint and distant, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of them. Hyun's face went pale as he looked behind them. It's following us, he said, his voice shaking. Daniel's pulse quickened, and he gestured for them to keep moving, faster this time. The footsteps were growing louder now, their rhythm unnerving, like someone dragging a heavy object across the floor. Then, without warning, the lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, and went out completely. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, swallowing them whole. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. And then came the sound, a low, guttural growl from behind them. Not human. Run! Daniel shouted, grabbing Hannah's hand and pulling her forward. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps frantic and erratic. Hyun followed close behind, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the growling was getting closer. In the darkness, Daniel's mind raced. They couldn't keep running blindly through the hospital's endless maze. They needed a plan, a way to escape. He scanned the shadows, looking for something, anything, that could help. Up ahead, a door loomed out of the darkness, slightly ajar. Daniel didn't think, he just acted. He threw himself at it, shoving it open with his shoulder. Inside was a narrow stairwell, spiraling down into even deeper shadows. This way, he shouted, dragging Hannah and Hyun through the door. The growling followed them, louder now, accompanied by the scraping of claws against the floor. They slammed the door shut behind them, plunging into the stairwell, but there was no time to stop. They had to keep moving. Daniel led the way down, the stairs twisting in a dizzying spiral. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the walls slick with moisture, the smell of rot almost unbearable. "Where are we going?" Hyun gasped, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his breath coming in short bursts. "But we can't stay up there." Suddenly, the stairwell opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was a basement, or at least it had once been. Now, it looked more like a crypt. The walls were lined with old, rusted medical equipment, beds, stretchers, and 4 poles covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a massive, broken-down elevator shaft, its doors hanging open like the gaping mouth of a beast. The growling echoed down the stairwell behind them, closer than ever. "We can't outrun it," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "We have to find a way to stop it." Daniel scanned the room, desperate for an idea. His eyes fell on the elevator shaft. It was deep, stretching down into an abyss. If they could lure the creature in, they might be able to trap it, at least for a while. "That elevator," Daniel said, pointing to the shaft. "If we can get it inside, we can drop it down." Hyun looked at the shaft and then back at the stairwell, where the growling was now almost deafening. "How do we lure it in there without getting ourselves killed?" "I'll be the bait," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "No." Hannah grabbed his arm. "You can't." "I have to," he interrupted, pulling free from her grip. "There's no other way." Before anyone could argue, Daniel turned and ran back up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The growling was close now, just above him, and as he reached the top of the stairwell, he saw it. The creature wasn't the doctor anymore. Its form had twisted into something far more grotesque, its limbs elongated, its mouth gaping wide with jagged teeth, its eyes nothing but empty black pits. It moved on all fours, its fingers ending in long, sharp claws that scraped against the floor as it advanced. Daniel swallowed his fear and shouted, "Come on, you bastard. Come and get me." The creature's head snapped toward him, its eyes locking onto his. It let out a deafening roar and lunged forward, moving with unnatural speed. Daniel turned and sprinted back down the stairs, his lungs burning, his legs aching, but he couldn't stop. Behind him, the creature was gaining. He burst into the basement just as Hannah and Hyun finished prying the elevator doors wider, creating a larger gap. They stood on either side of the shaft, their eyes wide with terror. "Now!" Daniel shouted as he ran toward them. Hannah and Hyun threw the last of their strength into pulling open the doors. Daniel dove out of the way just as the creature lunged into the room, its claws reaching for him. It didn't stop in time. The creature's momentum carried it straight into the elevator shaft, and for a moment, time seemed to slow as it hung there, suspended in the air. Its eyes widened in shock, its body twisting as it fell into the darkness below. There was a sickening crash as the creature hit the bottom of the shaft, followed by a long, guttural wail that echoed up the walls. Then, silence. Daniel lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his heart still pounding. Hannah and Hyun collapsed beside him, their faces pale and covered in sweat. Is it over?" Hyun whispered. Daniel shook his head, his eyes fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the elevator shaft. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But something tells me this place isn't done with us yet." The walls around Daniel, Hannah, and Hyun seemed to close in, as if the hospital itself were breathing, exhaling its madness into their very minds. The corridor stretched endlessly, littered with broken doors that led into empty rooms, except for shadows crawling across the walls. Footsteps echoed behind them, but whenever they turned, nothing was there. It was as if the hospital was toying with their sanity. Daniel's breath grew heavier with every step. His flashlight flickered again, and a realization crept into his mind. No one had ever left Gonjiam alive, at least not with their minds intact. But he was different, wasn't he? He had thought he could face whatever secrets the hospital held. Now, though, his hands were shaking. The primal terror growing in his chest made it impossible to think. The fear was no longer just about what they could see, but what they couldn't understand. Hannah, who had been frozen in panic, suddenly let out a strangled scream. Someone's calling me. She began to back away from the group, her eyes wild. Her voice wavered. I hear them whispering my name. Daniel's flashlight landed on her face. Her pupils were wide, her body trembling. He rushed toward her, trying to stop her from moving deeper into the shadows. Hannah. No one's here. But the words were meaningless. The hospital had her now. He ungrabbed Daniel's arm, his voice hoarse from fear. We have to get out of here, now. She's not herself. But before they could pull her back, Hannah bolted, running into the darkness. Her footsteps echoed, and then silence. It was as if the building had swallowed her whole. Daniel turned to Hyun, eyes wide. We need to find her. But Hyun shook his head violently, his face pale. We can't. She's gone, like the others. Gonjiam doesn't let go. We have to leave before it takes us too. Suddenly, a distorted voice echoed down the hallway. It was Hannah's, but twisted, inhuman. Daniel. Hyun, come to me. Their blood ran cold. The air became oppressive, suffocating. Every instinct told them to run, but they couldn't leave Hannah behind. They moved slowly toward the direction of her voice, even though every fiber of their being screamed against it. The hallway twisted as if the building itself were shifting, transforming into a nightmare maze. The voice grew louder. I'm waiting. Daniel's heart raced. He could feel the hospital pressing into his mind, whispering things he didn't want to hear. The hospital wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on their fear, their very souls. As they reached a large, iron door at the end of the hall, Daniel knew this was the heart of Gonjiam. Hyun hesitated. We shouldn't open it. But Daniel was beyond logic now. He shoved the door open, and they stepped into a massive operating theater. Old, rusted equipment lay scattered, and in the center of the room stood Hannah. Or at least, something that looked like her. Her body was hunched, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, her eyes black voids. The air around her shimmered with an unseen force. Hannah? Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. She smiled, a grotesque, twisted grin. This is where they all died, Daniel. Where the doctor experimented on us. Where we became part of the hospital. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The hospital had absorbed the souls of its patients, binding them to its walls, its floors. Hannah's body jerked, as if something else was controlling her. You came here for answers, didn't you? You wanted to know what happened. Now you know. Daniel backed away. We're leaving. Hannah, no, the thing inside her, laughed. Leave? You're already part of this place, Daniel. You belong to Gonjiam now. The room seemed to pulse. The walls closed in, tightening around them. Daniel felt the weight of the hospital's malevolence pressing down on him, dragging him into the darkness. Hyun collapsed to the floor, clutching his head, screaming in agony. In a moment of panic, Daniel turned to run, but the door had vanished. The hospital had consumed them entirely. There was no escape. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the twisted smile on Hannah's face and the sound of laughter echoing in the halls as Gonjiam claimed him. Months later, news broke of yet another group of ghost hunters who had gone missing in Gonjiam. The hospital stood silent and brooding on the edge of the forest, waiting for more victims. The legend grew, and so did its hunger. No one remembered Daniel, Hyun, or Hannah, except for the whispers that filled the night air around the decaying walls. Gonjiam never let its secrets die. It simply waited for the next soul to devour.